Okay, a little story by way of introduction to my guest today. In 1972, I started college at Glendale College. It's a community college. Wasn't sure what I wanted to study at all. And pretty much in high school, I studied sports and girls. So that was my background for academia. And community colleges at the time, at least in California, were free. So that was a nice way to get rid of my general education. And my first class was an astronomy course from Professor Richard Hardison, who was the best teacher I ever had. So just pure luck. Anyway, I was pretty much a middle of the bell curve student, but Doc Hardison had a class, an honors course for his best students, of which I was not. But I was so enthusiastic about learning, I asked him if I could sit in the back. It was just maybe a dozen students or so. So he said, sure. And anyway, each week we read a different book and then discussed it. I guess sort of setting the pattern for this podcast, because that's what I do. I read a book a week and discuss it with the authors. Anyway, one of the books we read was this book he assigned to us called Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. Here it is. Here's the actual book that I had from my library. My guest is laughing because he knows what's coming next. And at the time, this was 1973, this made total sense. The argument of the book is that there was a study. Here, I'll just read to you from the introduction. With the introductory material is by someone named Leonard C. Lewin. Leonard C. Lewin. The report which follows summarizes the results of a 2.5-year study of the broad problems to be anticipated in the event of a general transformation of American society to a condition lacking its most critical current characteristics, its capability and readiness to make war when doing so is judged necessary and desirable by its political leadership. Our work has been predicated on the belief that some kind of general peace may soon be negotiable. The de facto commission of the Communist China into the United Nations now appears to be only a few years away at most. It has become increasingly manifest that conflicts of American national interest with those of China and the Soviet Union are susceptible of political solution, despite the superficial contraindications of the current Vietnam War. Remember, this book was written in 1967. I think it was 67. It was published. Let me double check that. 1967, copyright. Anyway, it goes on and on about this. It's surely no exaggeration to say that a condition of general world peace would lead to changes in the social structures of the nations of the world of unparalleled and revolutionary magnitude. The economic impact of general disarmament, to name only the most obvious consequence of peace, would revise the production and distribution patterns of the globe to a degree that would make the changes of the past 50 years seem insignificant. Political, sociological, cultural, and ecological changes would be equally far-reaching. What has motivated our study of these contingencies has been the growing sense of thoughtful men in and out of government that the world is totally unprepared to meet the demands of such a situation. That is to say, if peace broke out, this could be a catastrophe for economics, politics, ecology, and so on. And we read this book, and it just made total sense. It's like, of course. There's a group of people meeting in this place called Iron Mountain where there's a nuclear bunker, and they're laying it all out for us. And anyway, okay, so fast forward 52 years to last year, and I get a letter from the editor-in-chief, executive editor, Rick Horgan of Scribner's, of Simon & Schuster, who says, please allow me to introduce myself. We corresponded several years ago, and he had a little bit of background of how we had met before. He said, trust me, if I didn't think this book that he sent me, it was a masterpiece, I wouldn't bother you with it. He's asking for a blurb. On the surface, Ghosts of Iron Mountain, here's the book he sent me, Ghosts of Iron Mountain by documentarian and political writer Phil Tinline, can look like a familiar menu offering an account of a literary hoax. But it is much, much more than that. Indeed, I believe it's a master key to the conspiracist thinking that has dominated American consciousness for the last 60 years. After editing over 400 books, I'm hard to impress, but truthfully, this book impressed me. Okay, so I'm reading this letter going, wait a minute, Ghosts of Iron Mountain, that sounds familiar. And I ran over to my bookshelf and pulled out the book and, oh my God, it's a hoax. What? I'm pretty sure my professor did not know that because that was 1973. Okay, so my guest today is the author of this book, Ghosts of Iron Mountain, The Hoax of the Century, Its Enduring Impact and What It Reveals About America Today. Love the cover of the scene from the War Room in Dr. Strangelove. Phil Tinline is a British freelance writer and documentarian. He's the author of The Death of Consensus, 100 Years of British Political Nightmares, which was chosen as the Times of London Political Book of the Year. Over the course of 20 years working for the BBC, he has made and presented many acclaimed documentaries about how political history shapes our lives. He's also written for the Times of London, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, London New Statesman, BBC History Magazine, and Prospect. Graduate of Oxford University, where he obtained a degree in English language and literature. He lives in London. The new book is phenomenal. Phil, thanks for coming on. Oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
Thank you. That's the loveliest introduction I've ever had. Thank you very much.
Is that a crazy story or what? No, so remind us of, my professor would not have known this was a literary hoax in 1973, right?
Well, if he happened to have been reading a particular page of the New York Times in 1972, he would have known, because Leonard Lewin fessed up, partly to publicize his next book, Triage, which is a novel, and he made very clear at the start of it that it was a novel with an author's note. But plenty of people wouldn't have seen that, and as we'll discuss, I guess, even today, some people refuse to believe that no matter what they're told about its origins, that this is a real book, because it chimes so strongly with people's sense that there is some sort of dark cabal at the heart of power, which means us all ill will.
Right. In other words, the hoax was itself a hoax because it was real. So it's sort of a meta.
That's how people read it, right? That's how people read it. Yeah. Yeah.
Give us a little bit before we dive into this. How did you stumble upon this story?
So it's kind of a sad tale, as in sort of nerdy, sado kind of behavior. I was sitting one Saturday afternoon, sunny day, at my iMac, when really I should have been outside enjoying the weather. And instead, what I was doing was searching old political science books from the 1960s for references to the military-industrial complex, like you do. Because I had this grandiose idea for a book about how the kind of conspiracy theory movie that we all have in our heads came about. Where did we get the idea of sheeple and the cabal and the plucky maverick from? And so military-industrial complex was something to look into. And I found these 3 different books all mentioned this thing called Report from Iron Mountain, which I'd never heard of, unlike you. And one of them seemed to think it was real, and one of them seemed to think it was fake, and one of them wasn't sure. So I thought, this is curious. And I looked it up, and there's a few paragraphs about it, sort of basic information online. And I literally wrote at the top of my notes, this is a really good story. And at first I thought this was a chapter of this book, and it just grew and grew. It was like the handkerchiefs coming out of the magician's sleeve. You just keep pulling and you just find more and more stuff. It's like, this is another chapter, this is another chapter. And it just became the whole book. And so that's how I came across it. And it's been fantastic diving into it and finding out how it came about.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into that. How did it come about? Who is Leonard Lewin, and who are the people behind him?
So this comes about in January 1966. First of all, this long forgotten, largely satire magazine in New York called Monocle, which is run by a guy called Victor Navasky, who you may know about, who was later editor and publisher of The Nation magazine, and his 2 henchmen, Richard Lingerman and Marvin Kipman. And they're sitting around a table in their office just at the north of Greenwich Village, and they're trying to find ideas, as always, for satire. They've moved from the magazine towards more doing kind of book ideas. And they see this headline in the paper about how there's been a peace scare on Wall Street, because it looks like talks might make some progress in Vietnam. So it looks like the possibility of an end to the war might be in sight. I mean, sort of sadly ironic to hear that now. But the idea that the stock market would dip at that point makes them think, hang on a second, it should be good news, right? And so with the minds they have, Navasky is a kind of steeped in Swift and Mark Twain and H.L. Mencken and so on. They think this is a perfect opportunity for satire. So what they decide to do is to cut a long story short, is essentially to bring in a writer who is going to help them tell the story of an entirely made up report, which supposedly would have been investigating what would happen to the American economy and American society if permanent global peace broke out. And the satirical joke being it would wreck the economy and it would wreck the society, and you would have to come up with all kinds of horrible alternatives to do the things that war does. So in order to keep young men under control, you'd have to have a version of slavery again. You might have to have eugenics to have some sort of control over the population. You might have to poison the rivers. You might have to invent UFO scares. You might have to come up with blood games. And this is all published as though it's non-fiction once our guy Leonard Lewin has written it. Now, Leonard Lewin came to this in a very different way. Whereas Navasky, Lingham and Kipman are born in the 1930s, they're perfect characters to really embrace and enjoy that fantastic moment at the beginning of the 1960s when New York is all about, the satire boom. Lewin is of an older generation. Lewin is born in 1916. Lewin's had a tougher time. And he spent a long time trying to be a writer and ending up working for his dad in Indianapolis. But he's finally got to New York. He's become a writer. He's done a treasury of American political humor. And so he's the perfect guy because he's not too well known, but he really knows his satire. He knows how to do this. So they ask him to write this book. They ask him to develop this project. And he's the one who says, right, what I need to do, if you want me to do this thing about this report, I need to write the actual report, because their idea was to tell the story of how the report had been so controversial, it had been suppressed by the government. And he says, well, I can't talk about its suppression until I actually write the report, right? So he spends a year and a half sweating over this. I talked to his daughter in his old house, and she said her image of him doing this is his head in his hands, just driving him crazy, working out how to do it. But what we end up with, as you discovered in 1973, is the full report on the terrible consequences of world peace breaking out. And then this thing at the beginning, the introductory material about how supposedly this professor who'd been on this secret study group commissioned by Robert McNamara had got in touch with Lewin and said, we've written this report and it's been suppressed, but it's got to get out in the public domain. Will you help me? And so Lewin's, the shtick is that Lewin is helping him publish it. And then it comes out into the public domain and it's published as though it's non-fiction by the publishers Dial Press. There's two fearless publishers, Richard Barron and E.L. Doctorow, later, of course, very famous himself. And so it's published as non-fiction, and people start phoning up and saying, are you sure, really? There was a government report saying we should reintroduce slavery and eugenics if war ends? And they say, well, look at the footnotes. The footnotes are all real. That's your substantiation. Actually, Lewin built in two fake footnotes as a kind of get-out clause. But, people phone the White House. The White House don't know if this is real because nobody's checked, so they have to hedge. And so the first news of this is on the front page of the New York Times saying that some people say it's a hoax, some people say it's real. And that little bit of uncertainty is perfect for the satirist, because then people start asking themselves the question, could it be real? And that's the point of doing it.
Yeah, I was just looking at his little bio line on the back cover. Leonard C. Lewin is a critic and satirist whose work has appeared in many newspapers and magazines here in the broad. He's the editor of, A Treasury of American Political Humor. Oh.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it didn't say that on the first edition, though.
Oh,
when
I
it
see.
first comes out, it didn't say that. That would have been a little bit of a giveaway. I can see on the top of your cover there, you've got the Delta logo right on the top of the front cover. So I think that's like a slightly later printing. I mean, it's the same design, but yeah, I think it was a slightly different quote on the front, and they didn't say that Lewin was a satirist on the first cover, because I think he would have given the game away.
So, but Dell Publishing, that's a major publishing house.
Yeah, well, Dial was part of this kind of slightly curious combination names. There's Dial, there's Dell, there's Delacorte. But Dial was based in this great cascade of a glass building on 3rd Avenue. And it's one of those brilliant things you get in publishing of a proudly independent publisher, but that's got the clout and the power of its owning conglomerate behind it. And so, yeah, that's why they were able to take these risks. These are the guys who published people like Norman Mailer and James Baldwin. And Richard Barron, the publisher of of Dial Press, is just this fantastic character. Even before, when he fights in the Second World War, even before he gets to Europe, he's already having to kind of work off a gambling debt by working as a shill in Phoenix City. He's just absolutely fearless guy. So the idea of publishing this thing and saying it's real doesn't faze him at all.
For satire to work, there has to be some plausibility to it. Not only that, but some truth to what you're talking about. Here I'm thinking of like the Alan Sokal hoax of the quantum physics and literary
social text
stuff, social text. I mean, the reason that worked is because they really do write like that, just utter gibberish that doesn't make any sense.
That's right.
And so it seems entirely plausible that there were people who were thinking about these sorts of things, like, oh dear, what if peace breaks out? We're making so much money on weapons and so on. And that goes all the way back to, the First World War, conspiracy theories about, who got drug the United States into the war. Well, these are the weapons manufacturers that wanted this war, and so on and so forth. But there is an element of truth to that. Somebody makes money selling weapons, and we can just take it all the way up to, I don't know, a couple months ago when RFKJ was ranting about the military-industrial complex, and we've just had too many wars, and he's left the Democratic Party because the Democrats are now warmongers and keep us in endless wars because there's so much money to be made. The Pentagon's never passed an audit, and on and on. It's like, wow, it's the same story.
That's right. And, as you say, there's no point satirizing something if it's obvious nonsense. That's the whole point, is to take a germ of truth, but then to take it too far. And that's the whole thing, right? Taking it to its so-called logical conclusion. And actually, satire and conspiracy theory at one level do kind of the same thing. They both do that. They both take something that's true and overextend it. It's just the satirist does it to expose its inherent absurdity, whereas the conspiracy theorist does it because they think it's actually the case. And so that, I think, putting those two things together, the fact that, as we'll maybe get onto, this was believed by many people really to be evidence of a conspiracy. So a satire becomes, not for the first time, becomes the basis for a conspiracy theory. If you put those two things next to each other, it teaches you, I think, how to think a little more carefully about this, because you're absolutely right. Like whenever you talk about conspiracy theory, the first thing a lot of people will say is, but there are real conspiracies. Absolutely, there are real conspiracies. I mean, you've written about it yourself. But that doesn't mean to say that all, theoretical conspiracies are real. So how do we distinguish between them? And one way of doing that is just taking the steps more carefully than sometimes people do. So, for instance, sometimes people talk about how, politicians behave like actors, right? They've got lines to take. They don't necessarily mean everything they say. They're good at faking emotion. But if you take that further and you say, politicians are actually being played by actors. There was this crazy theory I came across during the pandemic that the reason Joe Biden was wearing a mask was because actually his jaw didn't fit on properly, because he was all completely sort of fake human being, and they had to use a mask to cover the jaw. If you believe that politicians are actually actors, somebody else entirely playing a role, you've taken what appears to be quite a small step, but you've crossed this vital line into the world of conspiracy theory. And so the way I think about it is, if you kind of push things to their limit, if you push things to their absolute, that's when you need to be really careful, because very often that's where you tip over into conspiracy theory. But you're right, it starts with the germ of truth. I'm in no way saying the American war machine in the 1960s was actually unproblematic, and neither was Lewis.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite.
One of my favorite stories in 9/11 truthism is the line of demarcation. How far will you go? So the inside job people who think that, the Bush administration was involved, debate whether he let it happen on purpose, lie-hop, or made it happen on purpose, my-hop. Well, but then there's another group that says, well, there were no planes at all. And, it goes even deeper than you think. And then the regular 9/11 truth is, well, those guys are completely crazy. I mean, that's obviously false.
Right. Yeah. Well, exactly. Like with Kennedy conspiracy theory, right? Most Kennedy conspiracy theorists completely reject most Kennedy conspiracy theories.
Right.
They believe one, maybe a couple, from the stone or whatever, but they actually do reject most of them. So why do they reject them if anything is plausible? People, as you say, conspiracy theorists are often very skeptical and mocking of other conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. Well, then I coined, instead of my hop and lie hop, cow hop, capitalized on what happened on purpose. So it's like with Roosevelt in Pearl Harbor. Did he know, that it was going to happen? He let it happen to galvanize America. But, well, no, but once it happened, it's like, okay, here's our opportunity. We can support Churchill and the Brits and so on.
Right.
Or George W. Bush, like, okay, well, now we have an excuse to go to war.
Right.
And while we're over there, Halliburton, and hey, Dick, didn't you have a connection with Halliburton? And, and that's how the real world works. So there's that element of truth to it.
Yeah. No, there's a famous, or maybe not famous, but there's an essay written about My Lai and the fallout from that, and people trying to come to terms with it, I think. And the title is "We Didn't Do It, and Anyway They Deserved It."
Right.
And you heard similar things here after 7/7, the bombings in London in 2005. And what it feels to me to be is the event has happened, and it was always going to happen, and it was always going to happen that way. There's no sense of contingency. It's like this implacable thing, like sort of geology. Same with the Kennedy assassination. And so that implacable thing, which was always going to be exactly like that, we now need to sort of throw explanations at, or as you say, look for anomalies in. But actually, that's exactly the wrong way to read any given human event, right? You need to ask why it was happening in the first place and how it could have happened differently. So I think it's sort of quite telling that often people will, as you say, with 9/11 truthers, will sort of stick mutually contradictory explanations onto things sometimes, because what they're actually trying to do is sort of problematize the assertion that this happened in the first place, rather than actually arrive at a coherent new theory.
So there really was a Iron Mountain nuclear bunker.
It really was. But it wasn't in existence when the story starts.
Oh.
So actually, people could have found this in the cuttings library, and one guy kind of spotted it, but nobody picked up on it. The idea was, the backstory, the fake backstory, was that this had been commissioned under the Kennedy administration by Robert McNamara, effectively in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They'd been talking about it before, but it's commissioned in 1963, and they worked for 3 years, and then there's the report. But actually, the Iron Mountain bunker, the news of it, only got in the press in the beginning of 1966. So my surmise is that Leonard Lewin is, like a good satirist, reading the Wall Street Journal and other papers every day and goes, oh, hang on a minute, I know what I can do with that. But all anybody needed to do is just look up Iron Mountain in the clippings library, as I say, and they would have seen that it couldn't have had a meeting in it because it didn't exist. But it does exist now. Yeah.
Well, of course, the other problem is who has time to fact check all those sorts of things, right? You would think maybe somebody at the New York Times might have done that, but maybe not.
And there was always in that first headline, some people say it's a hoax, some people think it's real. There was always I think in some people's heads at least, an element of doubt. But as you say, why would you fact check it, especially if it confirms the story you think is true already? I mean, that's the real key to it, I think, and not necessarily what they were quite intending to bring out of it, but that so many people by 1967 had this sense that there was this malign presence in the core of the government, that when in the midst of the Vietnam War, that if you told a story like that, it just kind of made sense of things. And the really key thing is that lots of people say, well, it doesn't matter from the beginning right through to now. It doesn't matter whether it's really real or not because it feels true. And that's the fatal slip. There is a difference between whether it's actually factually true and whether it feels right to you. And if we ignore that line, we're in trouble.
So Davatsky and Lingemann and Doctorow and so forth, the idea behind this is, we know it's satire, it'll be exposed, but we're making a deeper point. The deeper point being there really is something like a deep state. Eisenhower warned us about this in his final speech, the military-industrial complex. So we're delivering a message.
Well, kind of. I mean, why they start off, they actually have two different motives in a way. Davatsky wants to satirize the idea that you would have this dip in the stock market when the prospect of peace comes up. So there's the idea of, the idea that the war is so essential to the economy that we kind of need to hang on to it. But then Lewin, I think, brings in this other idea, which is that there is this whole, which is a real bugbear of his. His daughter remembers still him talking about this, that there was this kind of cold, amoral logic at the heart of think tanks. Now, today we think of think tanks doing all kinds of things, but then, as you know, think tanks are quite closely pegged into the idea of defense intellectual. This is the Hudson Institute as originally founded, the Rand Corporation. Exactly. And so this idea of these people like Herman Kahn, these kind of cool logicians just going, well, it's better to have 50 million Americans killed in a nuclear war than 100 million Americans killed in a nuclear war. Don't call me a Nazi for thinking that through. Someone's got to do it. And Lewin's line is, no, sorry, that logic is just inhuman and we cannot do that. So actually that's what they're satirizing. And in order to do it, they have this sort of dramatic idea of the committee. But actually, the committee they talk about isn't in the heart of government. It's it's notionally people like, Galbraith is involved, but, he jokingly says he was, asked to be part of it. So sort of famous intellectuals really who are doing this meeting. They've been commissioned by McNamara, but they're not actually in government. But because we have this sense, as you say, in the wake of the Eisenhower speech in particular, that there is this sort of inchoate body that's running everything, it just gets sucked into that almost immediately.
Well, Kennedy's administration was a group of these egghead Harvard-type intellectuals.
Yeah. And noticeably, several of them quite a few of them stayed on when Johnson became president, which slightly problematizes the idea that Johnson had Kennedy killed. Why would he keep his cabinet?
Right. Right. Yes. But also, when you watch that The Fog of War, Earl Morris's film about McNamara, he really does talk like that. I mean, he's just kind of throwing these numbers out and charts and graphs and all the historical footage. They were describing, how many Americans would die, or like the famous scene from Dr. Strangelove, where George C. Scott's character is saying, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but, 10, 20 million tops, depending on the conditions.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. And, and what's so fascinating looking at it historically and from here, I guess, is that, all of this comes basically, right, from that moment in 1945 when it becomes public knowledge in the most brutal way that America has the atom bomb. And, within a few months, George Orwell, in an essay which also coins the phrase Cold War, is talking about how if you have weapons like this, power is sort of sucked into this hard, tight core in a country, because if you've got cheap weapons, as in the American Revolution, there is a degree of agency on the part of ordinary people. If the key weapon is one that is so expensive that only a very, very few people have control over it, you're already on the way to something that looks much more like tyranny. I mean, that's the basis of 1984, that idea. And so that idea, I think, I was surprised to find it so much as I was researching, keeps kind of haunting people all the way through. The idea that we've created this totally new country. America was not meant to be this. It was not meant to have, the CIA and the military-industrial complex. It was meant to be the Republic of Small Farmers. How do we end up here? You see Jim Garrison, for example, really sort of worrying and thinking about that. And I think that's what underpins quite a lot of this, because, it's easy to take that for granted now, but actually that was still quite, troubling for people 20 years in.
Yeah. Okay, other major characters in your story: C. Wright Mills, sociologist, author of The Power Elite, and then
Indeed.
The Causes of World War III. Talk a little bit about his role in this story.
Well, so, I mean, he dies 5 years before Report from Iron Mountain is published. But in order to make this make sense, in order for this not to be a kind of, funny and then rather unfunny anecdote, I needed to put it in the world that it was, coming out of and satirizing and expressing concerns about. And I wanted to set up the idea that, as I say, in the wake of 1945, you have this much more of a concentration of power at the heart of the American state, and that this bothers people on the left and on the right. It's not purely a kind of left-wing critique or a right-wing critique. And that's actually really important in the story of the book as it goes on, because it's invented by left-wing satirists and embraced by right-wing conspiracists, because they have an overlap in how they see centralized power. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do that in a sort of dry, long introduction where I was, lecturing you. I wanted to tell you a story. And C. Wright Mills is fantastically useful because he is the guy, as you say, who comes up with this idea of the power elite, this kind of nexus of business and military and corporate and politicians working in this kind of iron triangle at the heart of the post-war state. And he calls it the power elite. But his book, it seems, is read by Malcolm Moose, who basically wrote the military-industrial complex speech for Eisenhower. So you can see how these ideas from the left are kind of creeping in the discourse. But he's also just a brilliant character. Most Columbia sociologists in the 1950s, did not build their own houses. They did not race around on a motorbike, and they certainly hadn't kicked a racist in the face with both feet when they were a teenager. And if they had, they wouldn't tell people about it. He's just this really sort of vivid, enormous guy. He used to go for meals in Greenwich Village where he lived, and he would have a 3-course meal, and then he'd say to the waiter, "Can I have that again?" And just do the whole thing again. It's just physically and literally and ideologically kind of larger than life. And he goes up, even between those two books you mentioned, which are only 2 or 3 years apart, he goes on this really radicalizing journey. He writes his first 3 books are from a somewhat radical perspective, but they're scholarly, they're based on, deep research and so on. They're from very much within the academy. And then he gets so frustrated, I think, by the sort of sense of this kind of soggy 1950s consensus where both parties kind of agree, remember that? That he starts to become more and more of a rebel. And so The Causes of World War III coins this brilliant, I think it's the first book that he uses it, this brilliant phrase, crackpot realist, where he's trying to really get at the whole mindset that we've been talking about, this whole sort of military metaphysic. And then he goes even further. He writes this book called Listen, Yankee, The Revolution in Cuba, based on a trip to Cuba after the revolution, talking to Castro, talking to Che Guevara, which he writes in the voice of a Cuban revolutionary. And so by the end of his life, he has a heart attack in 1945. Has a heart attack in his mid-40s in 1962. And he's sort of become more and more marginalized, more and more radical, more and more of a maverick. But that's actually a perfect figure to kind of counterpose to the power elite, the military industrial complex. So he just seemed like it's a slightly left field move to begin the book like that, I think. But I hope it works, because I think it just takes you into the mindset from the side.
It's a great story. And by the way, your book is so readable. I just love the kind of romp down the history of the Cold War. It's really the best one book summary of the Cold War I've read. Here's what you write about Mills. This is him. I think he's speaking here. Many in elite circles have felt that economic prosperity in the U.S. is immediately underpinned by the war economy, and that desperate economic and so political problems might well arise should there be disarmament and genuine peace.
Right, that is him, yeah. And you can see the germ of, I think Lingerman's in his, I went to visit him and he kindly sort of spoke to me. He's in his 90s, so obviously his memory of exactly what he'd read in the 1940s is not, perfect. And we wouldn't expect it to be. He's not sure whether or not he read Mills, if I remember correctly. But, even if none of them had actually read that book, it had been a big deal, and it was in the sort of zeitgeist. So I think that idea was around. But, this was not them kind of taking it from him. It's what's interesting about it is different people are having the same thought. Right?
Yeah. Let's see. Some of the other quotes I like from this. He invoked Hofstadter's caution that there's a great difference between locating conspiracies in history and saying that history is, in effect, a conspiracy.
Exactly. This is the thing I was talking about before, right? That, if you see power as nefarious or, not to be trusted, fair enough. That's just sensible. The idea you should sort of, trust everybody on everything is just sort of ludicrous naivety. But if you go too far the other way and see the entire thing as fake or pre-orchestrated or a malignant plot, then you really end up in, the other version of it. It's almost like you go from gullibility through healthy skepticism to cynicism, and actually cynicism and gullibility kind of wrap round and meet round the back a little bit like the horseshoe theory.
Yeah.
So no, you have to be careful, because, taking it, as he says, taking it to a sort of totalized level is where you get lost.
Yeah, I quoted Catherine Olmsted in my conspiracy book, identifying the shift from old conspiracy theories about the Jews are doing this or the Catholics are doing that and they're trying to get in to influence the government, to the government itself is the conspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. That's the big shift. And she locates it in the First World War, basically, which is when the American state obviously really expands. You get the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, effectively trying to ban dissent, which is not particularly practical. But that's when you get the germs of what become the FBI. You get, perhaps not persecution, but people who are not convinced by the case for war being given a pretty rough time. And then obviously in the Second World War, you get a second expansion of it. But one of the things that strikes me about it that's curious is there is a kind of a fear of a tyrannical state much earlier in American history. It's not the American state, it's the British state. I mean, there is, and Mills talks about this, there is in the kind of, in the construction of the Constitution, as he says, a sort of fear of an over-dominant military establishment. John Adams worried about oligarchy and so on. But the line that really jumps out to me, and when I read this for the first time, I thought, oh, this makes sense to me. Always a thought you have to be careful with, but it did make sense to me, is in the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson talks about, how the British are trying to impose absolute despotism and absolute tyranny. And so it seems to me in a way that thought is, because it's in such a literally foundational document, that thought's kind of always there somewhere. It's kind of there when people talk about the robber barons after the Civil War. Some of the talk about the slave power perhaps has that in it as well in the mid-19th century. And then, as Olmsted says, from the First World War onwards, it's located right in Washington. And manifestly, that's still the kind of driving force. And I think you can see that driving, however wrong-headedly, driving what Elon Musk is doing right now.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Eisenhower gives his military-industrial complex speech. He's out. Nixon and Kennedy are running for the 1960 election. Kennedy is running on the missile gap with the Soviet Union, which is really weird if you think about it. The Democrat is is talking about this, and Nixon is going, no, there's no gap.
Right. No, exactly. And I mean, it couldn't be a better image, right? A non-existent gap. It's like, an absent absence.
Right.
And I mean, actually, there is a gap. It's just that the Americans are ahead of the Russians on missiles.
Right.
They've just convinced them. But the reason why it comes about is really interesting, I think, which is that just to sort of set out what the missile gap was. The missile gap was this idea, which came out partly from a thing called the Gaither Report, that the American security establishment was very worried that the Soviets had got ahead of the Americans on missile production. And Khrushchev was boasting about how they were producing ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, like sausages. Now, the evidence for that is A, Khrushchev's boasts, and then B, satellite photographs where people are either kind of looking at grainy images, basically seeing what they want to see, back to where we started with, there's always a germ of truth, but be careful how you read it. And then also, the fact that they aren't doing tests anymore is not an indication that their program has stalled, as the worrying people in America are reading it. It's that they're doing it in a different, more clever, more secretive, underground kind of way. So an absence becomes evidence, which is literally how conspiracy theory works, right? I mean, the big cliche about conspiracy theorists is if you say, no, but there's evidence that you're wrong, there's, but that evidence is produced by the plotters. So it's a real object lesson in the idea that, this kind of thinking is not just sort of some strange guy in a coat standing on a street corner. It's endemic, if you're not careful, to people who are making high-stakes decisions with imperfect information in situations of great power. And, the idea that conspiracy theorists are fringe is one we really have to get over.
Do we know if Kennedy knew at some point that there was no gap, but he continued it because it was a good selling point for his campaign?
Well, so Eisenhower gets very fed up with young Kennedy saying this sort of thing. And so he tells the Joint Chiefs to bring the candidate in and brief him on the actual situation. It's not clear to me whether what he's told is so held back by, worries about secrecy that actually he's not told enough to convince him, or he kind of is convinced but goes with it anyway. I think both are plausible theories. But certainly when McNamara comes into the Pentagon in 1961, he, it seems, sincerely is shocked that there is in fact no missile gap. So I think there was certainly an element of sincerity, at least in the campaign. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, one of my favorite, among the many favorite scenes in Dr. Strangelove is the mineshaft gap. So after the nuclear war, when everything is wiped out, but the chosen few will be able to carry on, it's all these powerful guys. They'll have all the women that they want, and they can make new families in these. They're going to live in the mine shafts. But then they're worried that the Russians have more mine shafts than we have. So there's a mine shaft gap.
Exactly. But it's just like, and it is obviously like, both terrifying and completely lunatic. But there's a couple of things that reminds me of. One is this paper, which I don't think anyone's particularly clocked, at least recently. This obviously satirical hoax academic article written by a guy supposedly in Hawaii around about this time, which basically says, on that same logic, says, now look, if we are going to be taken seriously by the Russians, we have to think through properly what we would have to do, what we may have to do when we're in the mine shafts and trying to survive after the bomb. And we may very well have to turn to cannibalism. We just have to face that and be grown up and look that in the face. Now, if that is the case, we need to start acclimatizing people to it now. We need to get advertising companies really making the case for a healthy and progressive form of cannibalism. And if we don't do that, the Russians are not going to take us seriously, and we will probably lose a nuclear war. It's just, you can just take this in all kinds of directions. I'm quite glad I missed most of the Cold War, because it just sounds like it was the 60s.
It's totally crazy.
Yeah.
We're going to eat the rich. Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. Right. How far do you take it? Well, again, but, people were buying bomb shelters and building these underground, protective concrete steel containers just in case. I'm 70, so I born in 54. So I remember in grammar school doing the duck and cover under the desk and thinking, well, I guess this will protect us from a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
Right.
Be absolutely fine.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is the reason Iron Mountain is there in the first place, right? Because it goes through this curious history from being an iron mine to being a mushroom farm. And then the mushroom farmer has a bright idea, exactly because of what you just described, this kind of, widespread enthusiasm for trying to have a shelter ready, should nuclear war come, in the 1950s. And he builds this effectively becomes to a large extent a document store, but it also has these amazing Baroque bunkers inside, as they described in the press at the time, with the world map on the wall and chandeliers and places for 90 executives and their families and all and their documents so that they can reconstruct their businesses after the war. And what's really funny about it, again, I mean, in a bleak way, again, like what you were just saying, is that actually, if you pause and think about it for a second, which some of the sharper journalists writing about this do, hang on a second. So what you're offering here is a nuclear bunker 100 miles from New York, where when the bombs start falling, your staff, your key staff, only the ones you've picked, the executives, are going to go 100 miles north from Manhattan, and they're going to go into these bunkers. And then B, when the war is over and everybody emerges, because they've got their documents and because they've got their executives, they can somehow reconstruct their business and start all over again in this kind of fashion wasteland. As one of the journalists says, all they'll need is customers. There aren't going to be any customers. It's just madness. But it's a great proposal, and it clearly worked. People paid for it.
Okay, continuing here with our Cold War history, Cuban Missile Crisis, General Edwin Walker. That leads us to Oswald trying to shoot Walker and JFK assassination. All that stuff is wrapped up in this. It's just such a great story. Pick it up there.
Yeah. So Walker is my kind of counterpoint to Mills. So you remember I was saying that I want this idea of the overly powerful center and the objections to that on the left and on the right. So Mills is the kind of intellectual critic of what's going on in what he calls the power elite. Now, Walker, General Edwin Walker, who is a brave and decorated soldier, just 30 years in the military, like Mills, a Texan, but a different kind of Texan. He eventually joins the John Birch Society, starts propagandizing to his troops, and thoroughly antagonizes the Kennedy administration and is relieved of his command. And so he emerges as this, sort of champion of the far right. Now, unfortunately, he's also not brilliant at speaking in public, and his ideas tend to come apart like wet cake on challenge. So he's not quite the man on horseback they expect. They get behind him for a while, but he is nonetheless, for a time, an extraordinary figure. People start using phrases like thunder on the right on the cover of Newsweek, I think, and so on. And so Walker is that kind of character. And then, because obviously Mills and Walker are in some ways not only on opposite political extremes, but very different, right? Mills is a serious Class A intellectual. Walker is, a retired general, but a conspiracy theorist of the first order. So I need another character. I need somebody on the left who is also more of a conspiracy theorist or thinks in a more extreme way. And lo and behold, there he is, Lee Harvey Oswald. And the reason I thought of this is I was just Googling around and seeing if there were any links, as it might turn out, between Mills and Oswald. And of course, there's no direct link. But on the leaflets that Oswald was handing out for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, there is a little ad for Listen Yankee, which tells the story of Cuba that the official narrative is not giving you. So, I'm not in any way saying that Oswald and Mills are in the same room, but they are both, pro-Castro, both critics of, centralized government power. And Oswald then does what Mills obviously would never do, which is he tries to attack the people on the other side. He tries to shoot Walker, and he comes within millimeters of succeeding. He goes up in Dallas to Turtle Creek Boulevard and shoots through the window and just misses him. And the curious thing is, I was sitting in a restaurant which used to be, I think, the First Republic Bank in Dallas when I was visiting. I went and saw all the sites in this story, and I was talking to the waitress about it, who was brilliant, really helpful. But I said, kind of, jokingly, being an Englishman, I said, "Have you heard of Lee Harvey Oswald?" And she went, "Yeah." And I said, "Have you heard of Edwin Walker?" And she went, "No." And I said, "Have you heard about Lee Harvey Oswald shooting or trying to shoot General Edwin Walker?" No idea at all. And fair play to her, she's got other things to do. But it's really striking that this story somehow, because of the way the JFK assassination theories have sort of gone the way they have, as you've written about, but not that many people seem to know that before he tried to shoot the great centrist Kennedy, he tried to shoot the great fascist Walker and failed. And so it just helped me dramatize through Dallas, through these characters, this sense that, you have the overpowerful center and people on the left and the right trying to find ways to attack it. So that's what I was doing with those guys.
Yeah, no, it's such a great connection there. Yeah, and that was April of 1963 that he tried to shoot Walker, right? And then so you're just talking about 6 months later, he kills Kennedy. You know, I always tell that story because it's like he not only could he do something like, he did try to do something like that with General Walker.
With the same gun, with the same rifle.
Yeah, the same. That's right, the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. Right. Yeah. Well, you know, as you know, I think Oswald acted alone. I don't buy any of the conspiracy theories, but I have to admit, he is one odd character. You know, if you were going to be a conspiracy theorist and look for somebody who's got a lot of weird things in his background and links and connections to a lot of people, that's Oswald.
Right. I mean, he is an extraordinary character. I mean, once I started reading about him, it did, you know, and in the texts that are not the sort of, you know, the conspiracist text, you know, there's this woman called, I think, Priscilla Macmillan, who's the only person that we know of who met both Kennedy and Oswald. She'd met Oswald when he was in the Soviet Union. When the news broke, she said, "I know that boy." And she writes this really thoughtful, brilliant book about it. So I think it's called Marina and Lee. Yeah. Great account of it. And there's other books of that stripe as well. I mean, my basic feeling about this, right, was that, I mean, I completely agree with you, that it was, you know, the evidence is so overwhelming that it's Oswald. And also, actually, the evidence of why people thought it wasn't Oswald is pretty obvious as well, right? It was a sort of jarring surprise, and you need an explanation. As you write, you know, you need something as big as Kennedy to have attacked him. Well, why? Well, it's worked the way they do. But what I wanted to do was not get caught up in that, much as the books on that have really sort of debunked the conspiracy theories are brilliant. Because it feels like because we've got spent so much time on the conspiracy theory, we haven't actually kind of gone beyond it and gone, well, actually, if we're sure that it's Oswald, what are the implications of that? What could we learn from that about what was happening at the time? I mean, and one of the things that strikes me, actually, to be honest, is it's surprising there haven't been more things like this in American history. You know, if you look at the way that young men were brought up, he's born in 1939. Look at his childhood. I mean, as you say, he's a weird guy, but it's not surprising considering his childhood, right? You know, his dad's gone. He's got an older brother he kind of idolizes, but that relationship's sticky. His mum doesn't really show him any affection. They move house constantly. You know, he occasionally gets a sort of father figure and then they're gone. And so what does he do? He joins the army. You know, he joins the Marines. You know, and what do the Marines teach him to do? Be a sharpshooter. Well, you know, are we not seeing that there might be some sort of problem here, gents? You know, because one challenge, right, to the idea that it's Oswald isn't it an extraordinary coincidence that this guy who just happens to be kind of a Marxist and happens to be pro-Castro just happens to be working in this building that Kennedy drives past? Well, yes, but are we saying that Oswald was the only 24-year-old, mid-20s young man in America who had a messed up childhood, may have been, as you say, like a psychopath or a sociopath, and had been taught to use a gun? Well, of course not. There may have been other Oswalds waiting in cities all over America, you know. So I think, you know, the other thing about Oswald, though, right, apart setting the conspiracy stuff aside, is I can't think of another person who, apart from, you know, one or two or three acts, has to some extent a really ordinary, rackety life, right? Whose life has then been picked over in so much detail. I mean, it's, apart from anything else, it's just this amazingly vivid, detailed window into what life was actually like in 1962, 63, which I think is worth hanging on to too. But yeah, he is a fascinating guy. Well, my favorite thing about him, I think, is that he watched this series, I Led Three Lives, about communist. Yeah, I think it's about a FBI mole in the Communist Party on TV when he was a kid, and he starts using false names. And you know, the idea that what, you know, conspiracy theorist angle would be, well, he must only be using false names because he's part of some great. No, maybe he's just a fantasist. Maybe he's just trying to make his life exciting. He's sort of rub it. You know, I don't know if you've ever been to. Have you ever been to the little house in West Neely Street where the backyard photo was taken?
Oh no, never been there.
Okay, so it was bought by a Kennedy conspiracist, I think, and you know, to be fair, thanks to that person, because it's great that it stays as it is.
Didn't know
right?
That.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is what I was told by the curator of the Dealey Plaza Museum, who I would think would be authoritative on this. But the thing that really struck me about that house is, you know, and it's only like the top bit. It's, you know, it's only the second floor. The ground floor is another apartment. It's so small. It's so rackety. It's so shabby and little.
Yeah.
And if you contrast that, I went up with the help of the waitress in the restaurant I mentioned, because I don't drive in America and I needed to get a cab. Anyway, I got up to Turtle Creek Boulevard where Walker's house is. It's a 5-bedroom house set back from the road, these lamps, and kind of dark. It's atmospheric. It's a lovely place to live. It's as I say in the book, it's another world from this rackety, crappy little apartment. And that in itself made quite a lot of sense of this guy to me. You're 24 years old. If you're a 24-year-old man, you kind of feel, at one level, you feel immortal. You feel full of energy and zest and possibility. And you're cramped into this tiny little space.
Yeah.
And nobody respects you. And nobody's sees anything good in you. And quite possibly for good reasons. He was domestically violent. But it's not surprising that he did strange and violent and, awful things,
Totally unhinged. It's a point I make to some conspiracy theorists, like, if you were going to hire a real cold-blooded killer to pull off this job, a Luca Brasi, really? Lee Harvey Oswald? This guy's a total nut. Well, the response to that is exactly who you would pick, so that they would make that kind of argument. It's a misdirection.
Exactly. Yeah. On which basis you should really pick a 7-year-old girl, right? Because then no one would guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and the other thing about that is just the idea that, this is what I was saying before, right? About, a historical event as this sort of implacable inevitability, which we then have to try and explain or problematize. Well, hang on. If you were the CIA and you wanted to kill Kennedy, if you're sitting down having a meeting about this, right? And somebody says, I've got an idea. When he drives in public through a public space with loads of members of the public around, why don't we get several people to stand in different places around that square and shoot him? Do you think, everyone, that is the most foolproof way to do it? I don't think you would have got very far. I mean, the guy had almost died several times. He was, as we know more than we did then, he was, quite gravely ill in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to do it, if you're the CIA and you're going to do it, why not try and contrive, a heart attack or some sort of medical situation, drop something in his drink, inject him,
like
do
Putin
it in
would
public like that. Sorry again?
Like
Putin. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, probably don't push him out of a window. I think that was,
that was,
I mean, I think, it's just that way of thinking is so like, why do it like that? I've never heard anybody say that.
There's a couple of British comedians, I forget their names now, that do satire like this, one of which was the murder of Princess Diana. You remember this? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get her chauffeur drunk, slightly drunk, yes, and then we'll hire some paparazzi to chase her, and they'll speed up, and we got to, but wait a minute, what if she puts her seatbelt on? Oh, she won't, because because women that are pregnant by the only man they've ever loved are notoriously slapdash about their safety. And it just goes on and on and on, and then they get the call, they go, oh, he can stand down. All that just happened by chance.
I know, it's brilliant. It's David Mitchell and Robert Webb. It's,
that's right. That's right.
Yeah. No, I mean, but you know better than I do. I mean, no, exactly. I think that's probably it. To be honest, watching that sketch is probably part of what made me think, hang on a second, this is just makes no sense. If you put all the other stuff aside, if you just wanted to do it, why do it like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then also I think there's a hindsight effect there and anomaly hunting where you take after the fact, well, who's the guy? That's that guy. Okay, now let's go through every aspect of his life that we can. Well, there's probably 1,000 people, like you mentioned, young men in their 20s that are into guns and that they're a little unhinged, that have weird backgrounds. And then there are 2 degrees of separation from this person or that person. And then you start connecting the dots.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's like if you take any given, take a group of people, at a talk or something and say, well, hang on, hands up who has ever worked for the government. Hands up who's ever worked for a corporation, and you just start kind of making links. I mean, a friend of mine, a brilliant journalist here called James Ball, who's written about this stuff a lot, has this fantastic encapsulation of the sort of the fallacy, which is, he says, people think that your job as an investigative journalist is to make connections. That's not the job. Making connections is easy. Your job is to make the connections and then kick them all and see which ones don't break. And so the idea that you go, we've connected this guy to that guy, his brother worked here, no, that's like, just ground zero. You have to actually test those things and show some significance to them. And it's also, yeah, as you say, just anomaly hunting. I think that's a brilliant phrase because it's exactly the thing. And you'll know this better than me. So tell me if you think this is right. But when I was reading your chapter on this earlier, what it made me think is this is actually not the way a historian thinks. It's the way a defense attorney thinks. All you have to do is sow enough doubt, problematize enough bits of evidence that you can introduce sufficient uncertainty in a jury to get your client off. And that is your job.
Yes.
And it feels like that's much more the method that's at work here. I mean, I think Mark Lane, one of the pioneers of this, was a lawyer, right? I mean, Vincent Bugliosi, he was also one of the kind of great debunkers, was also a lawyer. But I just think there's a logic there which is professionally appropriate in a defense attorney context, which is not appropriate for a historian.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a perfect analogy. It's like the OJ trial, the new Netflix documentary rehashing all that stuff again, showing that all they had to do was plant a seed of doubt in the jury of mostly Black African Americans from L.A. who had a very bad history with the LAPD over decades.
Oh, right, yeah.
That, it's possible that, they planted the bloody glove and the blood splatter on the door and all that stuff. And then they got Furman, who, on tape is using the N-word and saying some pretty nasty things. And it just all added up. Now, do they really think he didn't kill her? Probably not. The evidence is pretty clear he killed his wife and her friend. But it's the kind of thing that could have happened. And that makes sense historically. And yeah, okay.
I mean, if I'm honest, it's not a case that I know well enough to make a judgment on at all, make a kind of assessment. But, I see what you mean. And certainly, what's obviously true, as you suggest, is that, the history of, Black Americans being treated in a way by, the state and the court system and the police in particular, perhaps, in a way that is, frankly conspiratorial and unfair, is so, dark and horribly detailed that, you can see how that would play. I mean, it is one of the kind of great kind of sad ironies that, one of the things that makes conspiracy theory so popular is the bad behavior of power.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Vincent Bugliosi, because he did the same thing with the Manson trial, where he floated the idea of Helter Skelter and the White Album and all that stuff. And then it's come out later. There's a book called Chaos by Tom Collins.
Okay.
In which he says that was all bullshit. There was no Helter Skelter. That wasn't the motive. It was something else. And Collins thinks that the something else was that Charlie Manson was connected to the MKUltra program from the CIA of mind control. Okay. And it's a fascinating thing. I first saw him on Rogan, and he went on for 3 hours about this. Like, okay, I got to read this book. And so I read the book. It's like 500 pages later at the end, he goes, but after 20 years of researching this, I found no smoking gun. But it sure is an interesting possibility. It's like, oh, no, really?
Well, exactly. But the MKUltra is fascinating to me, right? Because, the idea of brainwashing, comes from two places, basically, it seems to me. I mean, apart from sort of, other things that are going on more broadly. Essentially, it comes from, actual, both Maoist and Stalinist forms of, brutalizing people in a combination of physical and psychological ways in order to get them to at very least say things that they wouldn't have said before. And if you can, to effectively believe those things, right? And there is some evidence that with sufficient brutality and sufficient skill, you can do something of that. You can see something of it in the Moscow show trials in the 1930s. I mean, the great scholar of this, the person who's really written thoughtfully and seriously and empirically about it, which is sadly rare in this field, I think, is Robert J. Lifton, who you may know about, who, interviewed people in Hong Kong who had been through the ringer in the early years after the revolutionary victory in 1949 and so on. And also had talked to, as you will know, American POWs who had been put through what he calls the export version of this in camps in North Korea. And, he calls it thought reform rather than brainwashing, which is a usefully less dramatic term. So there's that. But, the actual effort involved and the level of expense and brutality and time involved to get to that point is quite something. It's not something that an advert can do to you. But then there's also, the movies, right? The Manchurian Candidate and so on, this idea that you can have this perfect assassin. I mean, it's already there before I think before MKUltra starts, certainly before MKUltra is exposed. But once MKUltra is exposed in those hearings in the 1970s and books and so on, you get that it fits into the world. Excuse me. It fits into the world of the movie so perfectly that it's hardly surprising that it's landed, and that it creates satisfying stories that people want to believe, right? So I don't know. I think one of the things about it is I think the brainwashed assassin is kind of a little bit like the movie director's perfect actor because they do exactly what you want and they're really convincing. Right.
And they never screw up or change their mind.
Exactly. But also, more seriously, the idea that you could have this perfect and total control over somebody, it is, it speaks to very basic fears, as you know better than me, of how malleable people are. But yeah, the way that it ends up in fiction, and also Timothy Melley, the scholar Timothy Melley, has pointed out that part of the reason that they did MKUltra, I think this is right, was that basically one bit of the CIA was spooking another bit because they were kind of hearing that, they were basically putting out stories that they had skills they didn't have, and another bit of the CIA or the Russians did, and the other bit of the CIA think, well, we better do it as well, So the role of fiction in all this is so much more wired in than is healthy. But anyway,
well, back to your book's thesis that there was a receptive audience and culture for this book, Report from Iron Mountain.
Right.
Because, the CIA was doing these things. They were dosing U.S. citizens without their consent or knowledge. And then there was like the FBI COINTEL program in which they're spying on U.S. citizens who are civil rights activists and women's rights activists, Native American rights activists, all the way up to illegally recording, or I think it was illegal at the time, Martin Luther King's sexual trysts in hotel rooms and then blackmailing him. We're going to expose these. This is the U.S. government doing this to citizens protected by the Constitution. What? This stuff comes out in the church, in the church committee, and decades later, it's like our government was doing what? And WikiLeaks and all this stuff. We were spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone. What?
Yeah. No, exactly. One of the things that's curious about that, right, is I read Kash Patel's memoir, Government Gangsters, The Truth, Democracy, and the Deep State, the Truth, and the Battle to Save Our Democracy. I think is the subtitle.
Okay, I haven't read that.
Well, it's an eye opener. But one of the things he talks about is exactly that, the bugging of Martin Luther King in terms of the crimes of the FBI. He talks about the military-industrial complex. So that sense that there was, exactly as you just said, and as we've been talking about, this series of, overreaches, some of them which are, exaggerated in the telling, but that there were these overreaches from what should be constitutionally proper, and that there was this sort of sense of extreme concentrated power at the heart of the state, is something that is absolutely still in the system, but has been really kind of drawn on by, some of the people around Trump. But to go back to the MKUltra and COINTELPRO thing, I think at the time the book was written, I don't think people had a sense specifically of MKUltra, but they certainly had a sense that the CIA was overreaching. Certainly had a sense of that. I think. And they also, because Jim Garrison is accusing them of killing Kennedy at that point. And then, you had COINTELPRO, the sense on the left, I think the new left, that, that the state was up to no good. There was sort of sabotage, there was sort of infiltrators, there were, spies and informants and so on. So, yeah, I think these two things act in symbiosis. So the book comes out in 67 and it sort of speaks to that. But the other thing about it, I think, is that, this is published on the 1st of November, 1967. It's only a few months before the Tet Offensive. So it's kind of published at that last moment of, the economy is beginning to falter with all the spending on Vietnam and so on. But the American economy is still going gangbusters, and has done ever since the war, really. And, it's very, very confident country militarily. It's, very, very strong and so on. But it's just after this book comes out that then all starts to kind of fall into the kind of miseries of the 70s when, as you say, all these things were exposed. So Report from Iron Mountain, having been created at one moment, then kind of haunts, what happens afterwards, because it's so expressive of this idea of the kind of malignant state, even as the beneficent state, the Great Society and so on, is kind of coming apart like wet cake.
Okay, another character in your book I loved you discussing Tom Hayden. Here's what you write. Hayden after the JFK assassination. C. Wright Mills had described American society as fundamentally stable, a mass society in the hands of a powerful elite with shared interests. But the lone assassin Oswald had single-handedly shattered this stability and determined the presidency with a single bullet. I thought and wrote of him as a lurker, L-U-R-K-E-R, a member of a floating, lurking class disassociated from bureaucratic rationality, capable of turning hallucinations into history. But if he was not alone, if he was, in his own words, a patsy, then we were dealing with a violent conspiracy, perhaps reaching into the power elite itself. Either notion was enough to unsettle my world. That's a great line from
Isn't
Hayden.
it? And I think what I really like about that is it's really reflective and it's really honest, because those are the two options and they are both deeply unsettling. And, I think Hayden, having kind of, as you don't need me to tell you, but, been kind of the great sort of student radical in SDS and the Students for Democratic Society and so on the New Left in the 60s, and then eventually gone into kind of more sort of parliamentary politics effectively. Is somebody who has kind of seen this close up. Fighting the civil rights battle. In Georgia and Mississippi in the early 60s, going to jail, etc. He's seen American power in its sort of sharpest form. But the fact that he is prepared to say what you just quoted, I think, is really striking. Because one of the things, you'll know this better than me, but one of the things that people will say about the Kennedy assassination and the idea that it was Oswald is, it's just a comforting myth. If you just believe it's just this one guy, you don't need to think about the nefariousness of power. Well, up to a point, true. But what are you accepting? You're accepting that basically, as he says, a lurker, any random guy can just, upend the country. And the idea that is comforting strikes me as highly unpersuasive. And I think you can see that in all the imaginative effort that has gone into trying to prove that it was anything other than just one random guy. Mm-hmm. But of course, actually, I say in the book, actually, imagine that there had never been JFK conspiracy theory. Imagine that Ruby hadn't shot him. Imagine there'd been a trial, and imagine he's convicted. This does not seem particularly implausible, right? Mm-hmm. So if that had all happened, what would the impact of that have been? It's possible. I'm not predicting this, but, retrospectively. But the idea that actually what this assassination was showing was not that there was this sort of nefarious but very powerful American state, but that actually, however grandiose, the American state was actually really kind of vulnerable. I see it as a premonition of the Tet Offensive, that, one guy who you can't see with a gun can do you a lot of damage. That is not comforting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so there's the lefts, then let's shift to the right and the influence of all this on Liberty Lobby, and their publication Spotlight, and how that led to Timothy McVeigh and the whole militia right, and Alex Jones and Glenn Beck with his chalkboard, Alex Jones with his global elites and all that stuff. I ran into the Liberty Lobby people in the 90s when I was writing about the Holocaust deniers. Like, who's behind all this stuff? Like, Willis Carto and the Liberty Lobby and all that stuff. So what is the link with Report from Iron Mountain, Hoax, and the far right? Pick up after Walker.
Yeah. Okay. So we have the kind of setup with Oswald and Walker and Mills and the idea of the military-industrial complex. Then we have the book come out and the idea that it expresses these fears of this overly centralized state, and that the book is a product of, as we discussed, left-wing satire. And then, in 1972, Lewin says it was me, but then eventually in the 80s it falls out of print, and it seems like this relic of another time. But then, in the early 1990s, two friends of Lewin get in touch with him and say, your book is being advertised, it's being republished, and the people who are republishing it are extreme right-wingers. And, Lewin is on the left, he's also Jewish, and these people are, among the primary promoters of Holocaust denial. It's a absolutely horrible, jarring moment for him personally, but it's also quite striking in the story that we're telling, because the emphasis on the fear of the centralized state has shifted from the left, I think, to the right, and this is expressive of it. So what happens is that, as you say, there's this extraordinary character called Willis Carto, who, suffice to say, reportedly had 4 bronze busts of Hitler in his office, which gives us some indication of his political preferences, who is like a kind of micro-conspirator at a kind of, tenable scale himself. He kind of creates all these front groups. He doesn't he makes his calls from payphones and so on. So he's got a publisher called Noontide Press, based in Costa Mesa in California. He's got the Institute for Historical Review, which is this sort of faux academic institution which is promoting Holocaust denial. There's also Spotlight, which is this weekly newspaper or magazine. There's radio stations. There's Liberty Lobby, which is the sort of lobbying organization based in the same building as Spotlight, 2 blocks behind the Library of Congress, etc. And all of these things are kind of under Cato's aegis. And what he is trying to do is promote, and this may sound familiar, he is trying to promote a kind of nativist, populist version of, extreme right-wing ideas through wherever he can find a way forwards. And so Report from Iron Mountain is absolutely perfect, because here is the evidence that, the evil Johnson administration, the evil Kennedy administration had set up these sort of nefarious things. And what also happened, is that at this point, the Cold War is now over, right? At this point, people start to shift their focus in their interpretation of Report from Iron Mountain. Because as we were saying earlier, the way that the satire works is it says getting rid of war would be so damaging that we would have to find lots of extreme measures to put in their place. Eugenics, slavery, alien scares, poison the rivers, blood games. And it's those things in the 90s that really start to become front and center, because they then allow you to explain all kinds of things that you're against, whether it's, environmental regulations or, NAFTA or whatever. And so it becomes a way of explaining this kind of disorientating new world of the 90s. So it's republished by, as I say, by Noontide Press, simply by basically photocopying a version and putting a new cover on it, because they think it's a government document, so it's in the public domain. So there's that strand to it. But there's also the way that it finds its way into the militia movement, and which is, is emerging in the early 90s. And again, because it explains so perfectly, it seems, the idea that there is this sort of nefarious cell at the heart of power that means to do real Americans wrong.
Yeah, I went to Costa Mesa and visited the Institute for Historical Review. Mark Weber was in charge of it at the time. And then I went to a few of their conferences. David Irving came to speak a few times.
Right, yes.
Your compatriot there. He's a
yes.
bigger than life character, but boy, what a storyteller. I mean, just an incredible storyteller that just had everybody, just in his thrall. But then the book table was always interesting. I can't remember now if they had Report from Iron Mountain on the book table, but they had Henry Ford's The Eternal Jew. They had the Protocols, they had Mein Kampf, all this stuff. It's like, wow, this is incredible. Who's buying this stuff?
Right. Well, and Report from Iron Mountain is talked about. They say, is it secret protocols or is it brilliant satire? I mean, it's juxtaposed with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, of course, at the risk of going down another rabbit hole, but isn't totally logically accidental, right? Because what does the protocols of the Elders of Zion consist of? What does the Russian forger or whoever it is who confects this totally fake document which purports to show that there's a Jewish committee that's trying to kind of, that secretly runs the world? What it consists of is partly a novel, but also this French satire on Napoleon III, a dialogue between Machiavelli and Montesquieu in hell, where, the Machiavelli character, which is mocking Napoleon III, talks about all these clever ways he has of manipulating the press. It's a satire. But as soon as you take the satire label off it and say, whoa, this is real, you get the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So there is a kind of horrible logic to the fact that these two things are juxtaposed. But I'm really interested by the fact you went to their building. What did you find? When were you there?
Let's see, that would have been, around 94, 95, I think.
Okay, right.
We did a issue of Skeptic on Holocaust Denier, then I wrote my book, the Denying History.
Sure.
So I got to know those guys pretty well. I visited Ernst Zundel in Canada. He had a big Aryan-looking bodyguard, which is kind of funny. He himself was kind of a goofy guy.
Right.
I got to know most of them that were, involved at the time. Bradley Smith was buying ads in university newspapers, offering like a $5,000 challenge to anybody that could prove the Holocaust happened. Just show me one piece of evidence that the Holocaust happened.
Yeah, I remember.
How about this report here? How about this? Oh, no, that doesn't prove it. And, they, of course, shoot down every little piece of evidence you present. But I just thought it was an interesting exercise in, distorting history
Right.
What is behind it? They wrote a lot about what the Jews are doing, or the traditional enemy, what they're up to. Not just distorting the Holocaust or the Second World War, what actually happened. They also had an interest in historical revisionism of World War I. And it kind of touched back on this, the arms, munitions people were,
the merchants of death.
Merchants of death. Yeah, they were into that stuff. It was quite interesting. Most of the people that attended these conferences, they weren't largely attended, maybe 50, 60 people in a small hotel room in Costa Mesa. They were not advertised. You had to, kind of word of mouth or a mailing list, and then they gave you like a passcode or something. It's almost like you knock on the door and they open it up and, who killed our Lord? It was the Jews. Okay, you can come in.
Right, okay. Okay. Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a little bit.
No, sure.
But there was also a sense of natalism and like, this was in the 90s, but also, the concerns about immigrants, both in Europe and the United States, kind of contaminating the white culture, not just blood and soil, but also culture. And, it was Western culture that made the world great, and this is being lost now. You still hear some of this in like some of Douglas Murray's discussions about the strange death of Europe from immigrants. There's a debate to be had there, and all that, I recognize, but, there's an underlying current there that goes way back to some of this kind of thing, I think.
No, that's definitely true. And one of the things that's so slippery about it, of course, is this idea of, challenging the official narrative, right? Because if you are challenging the official narrative when the official narrative is, the president did nothing wrong, then that is absolutely fair and proper. If you're challenging the official narrative that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, that is not fair and proper. Not only did it quite obviously happen, but it's also deeply nefarious to do that, but also it's corrosive of the thing that I mentioned before, of proper challenges to power. And this is what's so slippery and sort of queasy about this, is that the very tools that you need to use to, combat some of this stuff are also useful to the people you're combating. So, the idea of disinformation is one of the most powerful tools for disinformation, because if you can, as we were talking about before, if you can just bring in enough doubt, if you can just problematize trust in information enough, you actually gain. You don't need to be convincing people of something new. You just need to kind of flood the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon would say. Yes. Which is curiously similar to a line in JFK. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, so like one of my favorite studies done in conspiracism was called Dead and Alive, title of the paper, about people who tick the box that Princess Diana was murdered are also more likely to tick the box that she faked her death and she's still alive somewhere. Well, she can't be both dead and alive, right? So the Karen Wood and her colleagues' interpretation of this is you don't trust any authoritative narrative, no matter what it is. You're not getting the truth. So they said she was murdered, or they said she faked her death. Whatever anybody says, I'm going to believe the opposite, right? So they don't trust any authorities. And I think maybe that's the link between the left and the right interest in this book and also conspiracy theories, is that we just don't trust the state, whoever's running it.
Right. No, exactly. I think that's right. And that also has to be taken seriously. The fact that people are thinking in that way, right? I mean, the phrase I use about it is it's a kind of red flashing light on the dashboard of a democratic state. If a huge number of citizens do not trust the state to a point where things are really no longer functioning, or the people you want to bring into power are going to effectively try and destroy that state because they think they're purging evil effectively, you have a really big problem. I mean, one might say that where you guys are at the moment is at a different point on the journey to where we are, but we're in the same fundamental predicament, I think. And so this is again why it's so slippery, because you have to challenge and sometimes mock and debunk these things, but you also, I think, have to. I mean, I wouldn't say this of Holocaust denial, but I think the run-of-the-mill person that you meet who believes the moon landings were faked or thinks the CIA killed Kennedy or whatever, I think that is something that you have to kind of engage with the person as well as with the ideas, however wrong-headed, because we have to kind of get people back to some kind of trust in shared trust in truth, or democracy can't work. So I don't know. I find myself veering on conspiracy theory between, going, this is just ludicrous, and okay, why do you think like that? What's your vision of what people in power are like? Because I kind of know some, and you don't maybe know any. So what do you think they're like? Let's see if we can talk about that. You know what I mean? Because otherwise we're lost.
Okay, Timothy McVeigh, the truck bomb. This is based on the Turner Diaries, a novel, right? So people act on ideas, yeah. But there, the right-wing militia doesn't trust the deep state, or I don't think they called it that at the time, but, we're going to respond through violence, and there will be some collateral damage. He called the children who died at Oklahoma City bombing. So then, how far does that go? I think the militia movement was kind of hit its peak in the just around that time, and then I think a lot of people got turned off by the violence of that.
Yes, that's true. I mean, if you look at the sort of Southern Poverty Law Center reports monitoring it in the mid-90s, there is some evidence that it it continues, but manifestly the horror of the Oklahoma City bomb. McVeigh wasn't. He was in that world, but he wasn't sort of formally attached to one particular militia. But, the idea that those ideas would lead to that, atrocity obviously had, a kind of chilling effect. But then there's other things as well that creep in as well. I think one of them actually, in a way, is the millennium bug. That becomes quite a big focus, that people worry about the millennium bug and then it doesn't happen. And that perhaps has a kind of a kind of cooling effect as well. But then I think the really big one is 9/11, right? I think, yeah. Because if you think about the politics of, let's say, Alex Jones and MKUltra, right? If you're talking about Obama or Trump, they may take more or less extreme positions, but they are fundamentally, in broadly the same part of the forest. But if you take the invasion of Iraq, or indeed 9/11 itself, Coulter's position would be much more, neoconservative, pro what Bush was doing at the time in a maybe critical way, but fundamentally there. You look at what Alex Jones is saying at the time, and he, having perhaps had a possibility in the 90s of becoming a figure of some influence, I think looks more marginal at that point, because he's saying the whole thing is a false flag. It's all the deep state, or the police state. He's making, fevered documentaries about the Bilderbergers and the police state and so on. And actually that's a complete split, because, one part of the fairly tough right is, basically pro the central state, and the other part is frightened and suspicious of it. And I think that continues through much of the noughties. But I think once you got the crash and Obama and Iraq going, really wrong, I think you can then see it start to come back together. You have the Tea Party, which is not entirely this, but it's, some of it is adjacent. And then you start getting Trump doing the birther stuff, and then you can really see it resurging. But there is also a David Newert, the real sort of scholar of one of the real scholars of the sort of militia movement and that side of the right, talks about how much it resurges around 2008, 2009. They start having, big meetings again and so on. So yeah, I think it's right to see the roots of now in the 90s, but it does kind of, go around a long tributary before it comes back after the crash.
I'm going to read this portion from your book on Alex Jones. As a teenager in Austin, Alex Jones was captivated by a story about power. None dare call it conspiracy. I have that book there on my bookshelf. Right. Was a propagandistic bestseller by a man named Gary Allen, a spokesman of the John Birch Society. Along with Iron Mountain, it appears to have influenced Silent Weapons. That was Alex's, one of his films. None dare call it conspiracy opened young Alex's eyes to the big secret. It was the world's bankers, not the politicians, who really controlled America. Alex was 19 when hundreds of miles to the north, the Branch Davidian compound at Waco went up in flames. Here were the dark forces of the power elite in action. He dropped out of community college and started a call-in show on public access television. Such a great background to him. But, the Waco thing, that was a disaster. This is, the government at its worst.
Right. And then, reading back now, the sort of, not just, Waco was the kind of apotheosis of it in a way, and what had happened at Ruby Ridge shortly before that.
Right.
But, just the idea of SWAT teams, the idea of the militarization of the police. And there's an early documentary, but Silent Weapons, I should say, by the way, is a book that was influenced by Iron Mountain. But anyway, If you look at Alex Jones's early documentaries, I spent a fun Christmas, I think the Christmas before last, watching repeated lots of Alex Jones documentaries on YouTube, which
painful.
Yeah, it wasn't all that festive, if I'm honest. But, he was going around talking to people in little towns where there'd been some sort of, military exercise effectively to do with, what they would do in particular emergencies or effectively sort of martial law scenarios, and go in very concernedly saying, did this worry you? And, what did you think? And what did you see? And was it frightening or whatever? And, those things are frightening. Mm-hmm. It's just that if you take it all the way to saying this is all in the creation of a police state, this is a totalitarian thing in the making, or everything is an illusion, that's when you go to Alex Jones' world. But no, I mean, policing in the 90s in America was clearly, not in the right place. And as you say, Waco was, the management of Waco, as ever, it's cock up, not conspiracy, right? But the management of the Waco siege was quite clearly disastrous.
Well, David Koresh apparently went into town periodically to get his hair cut and go shopping, wherever they could have just picked him up.
Did he? I didn't know that.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Instead they have this massive, surround, and we're gonna send in the troops and the armed guards and all that.
There's a sort of disagreement between, I think, if I remember correctly, there's partly a disagreement between different bits of the FBI, and also, at least early on, between the ATF and the FBI. But there's a sense of essentially, do we coax people out by talking to them and play a long game, or do we, use threat and force?
He was a bad dude. He was definitely, hoarding weapons and molesting children and so on. Yeah, okay, but
what it devolves down to in the end, doesn't it, is, when the building catches fire, when they start ramming holes in the walls and pumping in tear gas or whatever, on the assumption that the remaining people inside will then come out, and then the building catches fire.
Yeah,
who set fire to the building? Now, there's this famous, very ironically named, based on what I was saying before, this film called Waco, the Big Lie, which this lawyer circulates, right? Where there's this, what appears to be a kind of flash, which seems to be one of the FBI tanks or whatever, firing, basically an incendiary, which is going to set the building. It's actually light glinting or whatever. Now, this is one of the things that really influenced McVeigh, and he insisted it was played at his trial. But no, this sense that there was effectively a state massacre on TV on the 218th anniversary of the American Revolution beginning as well, was a pretty extraordinary thing for the state to have got to the point where people would believe. My impression pretty strongly, given the investigations and the tapes of Koresh and so on, is that the fire was actually started by Koresh and associates, and that they are responsible. But for the government to have got themselves into a position where, people would believe that they had caused it is in itself not ideal, right?
Right. Yes. As a counterexample, then, when the state went after Warren Jeffs, who was the head of the fundamentalist Mormon church, these are the polygamists, and he was having sex with children and so on. They just pulled him over. They just waited till he was out driving somewhere and pulled him over and hauled him in, so they didn't have to do a big dramatic surrounding of the church in Texas and all that.
Right. And I think there was it was not the same thing as either of those, but there was a case, I think, in Philadelphia. Actually, I'm not going to talk about it because I can't remember enough detail. But
just continue on with some of your interesting stories here. The Bohemian Grove, another one. I really want to go.
Well, if you go, tell me all about it, right? But, that was John Ronson went.
Yeah.
This is this is a good example, right? John Ronson goes, and John Ronson effectively goes with Alex Jones, I think, and they both make stories about it. And John Ronson's is ironic and playful and sort of has a satirical edge to it, I guess. And Alex Jones says, this is the kind of the inside the belly of the beast,
Right,
and it's just hang on to a sense of the ludicrous chaps, which John Ronson has in spades, but just the I don't know, it's this idea that no one ever does a prank and then reveals it. No one ever makes a mistake and then corrects it. Everything is perfectly thought out. So point me to one time in your life that was ever true, that everything worked perfectly. Try and organize a conspiracy in a big organization. I used to work for the BBC. Try and organize a plot. Seriously.
Impossible. Yeah. But powerful people do meet in private.
Yes, they
I
do.
don't know if in secret,
yeah.
but private. I mean, they do belong
of
to
course it is
clubs
secret, yeah.
like
Yeah.
the Skull and Crossbones Club at Yale University that the Bushes were part of and all that stuff.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Bohemian Grove, mostly it's old guys peeing on trees and having a boys' weekend,
Yeah.
I guess. But, you can't help but wonder, sometimes maybe they do have some conversations about, national security issues or foreign policy or whatever.
Exactly. Again, I mean, of course there are effectively secret, certainly, private and carefully not revealed conversations, in power all the time. And actually, it would be impossible for, to run anything of any level of sophistication without that, right? If everything was
Right.
minuted and public and done on Zoom calls that anybody could watch, you
Right.
couldn't function. You would end up with all the sort of secret text that you were trying to make sure people couldn't see on the Zoom call. So I think the issue about it is kind of, and anybody would accept, I think, that a degree of secrecy is fair enough. But the problem with it is that you kind of get the image I use in the book is that the high walls of the national security state become a blank canvas onto which you can project anything you want, and that's the issue really. Is you create these sort of zones into which you can flood the sort of conspiracist movie you've got in your head.
Yeah. All right, let's pull this up to current events.
Yeah,
I think in the long run, historians will probably have overdetermined the cause of Trump's success. There's many causes, but I think one of them is this concern about a deep state, that an outsider like him, who can't be bought off because he's rich, he doesn't need to be any more famous or whatever. He's just going to get in there and expose the rot that's in there. And now, pretty much daily news coverage is pretty entertaining with him and Elon Musk standing there with his kid on his shoulders talking about what they discovered in the deep state. It's mostly probably just bullshit bureaucratic stuff like $40,000 hammers at the Pentagon, that sort of thing. But people can't help but think there's something deeper in there that he's going to uncover.
Yes. No, but the thing about it, the thing that really strikes me about this is the word state. If you look at the book, which is a fascinating book by this guy, Mike Lofgren, who was a long-time staffer on the Hill for about 28 years. I think he was working to the House and Senate budget committees for the latter part of his time, and eventually kind of resigns in disillusion in about 2013. What he means, and he writes this book called The Deep State, which I think is partly how the term ends up in the discourse. He gets it from the British spy novelist John le Carré, who I think got it from what was going on in Turkey with the sort of military in the background. But what le Carré is talking about is private defense companies being given access to intelligence in a way that is not accountable, whereas civil servants and certainly politicians are, more accountable. So there's a sort of, a new clandestine but private sector effectively element to it. And then that's kind of what Lofgren writes about as well. So my feeling is basically, I really wish he hadn't called it the deep state, because what he's talking about is partly, elements of the administrative state for sure. But he's also talking about the NSA, but he's also talking about Silicon Valley and Wall Street, right? Now, those are not the state. Yes, they have connections to the state. The state needs to have a relationship with them, but they are the private sector. And there just seems to me I find it kind of frustrating to watch that, there are manifestly problems with all four of those expressions of power in America. I'm in no way saying the American government is unproblematic, but somehow, whenever people have a sense of disempowerment, of frustration, of being humiliated by the system, somehow rhetorically, it all seems to end up on the state, on the government. Maybe partly, you tell me you'll know better than me, but maybe partly because the federal government is for many Americans so physically distant and administratively distant. You've got your state governor, you've got your state, Congress and so on, which is a little bit more tangible. And the idea there's some strange, vague figures far, far away who have influence over your life. I can see why people would read it that way. But the thing that was really striking was that moment in November when the United Healthcare executive was shot outside the hotel. And you had this absolute, tell me if you think I'm exaggerating this. I'm reading this from social media, largely. So maybe I am. But my impression was that there was this absolute explosion of humiliated rage, basically. Like, my mother was treated this way. I was treated this way. My grandpa, why do I have to live in fear of this company just going, no, All the jokes about that he was, his claim was denied because he, or he was charged for the ambulance that he died in. I mean, pretty dark stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The man was killed. But Trump was pretty much silent on that for over a week. And, this was a chief executive shot about 4 blocks from Trump Tower. As I understand it, that very hotel is where he had his celebration in 2016. But there's a glimpse of a different kind of an angry anti-power populism. I'm not supporting it. I'm just trying to read it. But it feels to me like this phrase deep state actually pulls people away from some of the things that they're actually really angry about. And that somehow, therefore, you end up with Musk, who is of Silicon Valley, being the kind of great, tribune of the people when, he's the richest man in the world, And so there's a sort of disconnect there. And it feels to me that until that's kind of unpicked, I've been reading a lot about Teddy Roosevelt recently because I think he did it the opposite way around, right? He is like, the state is the instrument of the people to push back the power of the interests. But ever since Woodrow Wilson, it's not quite been like that. So, up to a point, I mean, FDR, but it just feels to me like there's this kind of twist, this Moebius strip. And until that's untangled, this is just going to keep going and going. Tell me if you think that's wrong.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
I think
just
that's
my theory
right.
from here. But
no, I think that's absolutely right. Well, I mean, first of all, Teddy Roosevelt was the trust buster, right? And he was a moneyed, propertied, wealthy guy who said, I can tell you how it works from the inside. And it's corrupt, right?
Another rich New Yorker.
Yeah, we need deep state. We need like deep corporation or the deep corporate power. We need a phrase, a 2-word phrase for that.
You get it a bit in big money and big tech and big food.
I mean, big
it's
pharma.
Kind of there, but
I mean, again, RFKJ's comments about the regulatory capture by big pharma. It's true. The whole opioid crisis came about because they basically bought off the regulators that allowed them to continue to sell these powerful opioids.
Right. And
that happened.
Right. I'm going to interfere in another country's politics, but it strikes me that if possibly more Democrats had been more vocal about that, Democrats who weren't also believers that vaccines, didn't work or, the various kind of frankly crazy things he believes, if they won't say it, somebody will. And it's a conspiracist. So this is, again, the red light flashing on the dashboard. You've got to actually engage with this stuff before it ends up with it driving a conspiracist to be the head of the American healthcare system.
Yes. Well, here we are. Yeah. Well, again, I guess it's natural to think, I mean, there's actually research on this, that, when you're outside of power, you think the people in power have more power than they actually have. How powerful are CEOs really of Fortune 500 companies? Well, a lot more powerful than me, but they can't do anything.
For sure. And that's definitely true with politicians as well. I mean, that's one of the things that's most striking about it is that the more that, my reading of it in very, very basic, crude terms is that, if you set aside the military for a second, I know this whole thing is kind of about the military, but set aside Reagan's big spike in military spending and just look at the kind of the capacity and largesse of the American state from the Great Society, through all the way to today. I mean, the basic trend line to me seems to be downward, right? There is less capacity, there is less confidence, there is less investment. The public infrastructure, just like here, I'm not saying this is specific to America at all, the public infrastructure has been let rot to some extent. And yet somehow the idea of the state has got more and more and more, omnipotent in our heads. Maybe we should balance those up a little bit.
Yeah, well, whoever has the power and the money is suspect. So it was Bill Gates for a while. He's kind of fallen off the wagon there. For now, it's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos or whoever's there.
Yes, indeed.
All right, I'm going to read the final passage from your book. It's so good.
Okay.
Shared stories are certainly vital to democracy. As George Packer has argued, nations require more than just facts. They need stories that convey a moral identity. As Phillips and Milner put it, merely yelling at someone about how wrong they are isn't going to tell the sort of alternative story that might get them to start seeing, or at least start being open to the possibility of seeing things differently. And stories are crucial to challenging power and pushing for political change. But today, politicians across the spectrum are retailing fiction-filled worldviews which fuel mutual incomprehension and hostility. In such a world, we really need to be able to distinguish between fact and fiction. We no longer have the luxury of seeing everything as narrative. The tale of Report from Iron Mountain offers a warning about the consequences that await if you don't keep an eye on the line between your deep story about how power works and what the facts support, between what feels as if and what is. That's great. What feels as if and what is. There it is. Ghosts of Iron Mountain. What a great read. Oh my God. Such a great story.
Thank you.
You're such a good writer.
Oh, it's very kind of you. It's great to hear. Thank you.
What are you noodling on in the next book or future articles or whatever?
Well, so I've just done a piece about the interests of British conservatives in Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, really?
So that's in the edit at the moment. Yeah, and I've written a piece about the surge in the gold price and the idea of kind of hoarding gold, and how literature advises you that actually that's possibly a bad idea, and what that embodies, and that takes you back to the 90s as well. Everything in my head goes back to the 90s militias. But anyway, and I'm toying with new book ideas, maybe something around what we were just saying about a kind of a way of having a critique, or a sort of story of moments when there has been a kind of populism which has critiqued effectively not just government. And I'm toying with various other ideas. I have one idea about optimization, and whether does optimization make life better, or does it just make it more extreme?
Oh, interesting.
That sort of thing.
Okay, all right. British interest in Teddy Roosevelt. I had no idea. Okay, he's a bigger than life character. Oh my God, when you read his biography, it's incredible.
I mean, yeah, it's one point where he jumps. He's in Colorado. And he jumps off a horse, kicks his hunting dogs or whatever out of the way, and kills a cougar. I never know how to pronounce it. Is it cougar or cougar?
Cougar.
Cougar, right.
Yeah. Kills
a cougar with a knife. Now, you can talk about masculine energy as much as you like, Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, but bloody hell.
Oh, no, this guy had it totally in spades.
Yeah.
I mean, his wife and daughter both died on the same day.
Wife and mother.
Wife and mother, in childbirth. Yeah, right. And so he moves out west to recover from all. Yeah, it's just
becomes a rancher in the Dakotas. Just astonishing. Yeah, I mean, and problematic too, right? I mean, he was a racist imperialist eugenicist.
Yes, well,
but there are some ideas in there that the founders of the British welfare state were in many respects eugenicists. So you do have to, provided they haven't gone too far, pair away one from the other. But yeah, he's a fascinating guy. Anyway.
All right, Phil, that sounds good. Thank you.